Welcome to the Tales of Leadership podcast. Sandy, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be on this with me and share something that I love, a passion of mine, which is leadership.
And thank you, Josh, for having me on. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, you have over 40 years of leadership experience. And the first question that I have to ask you is throughout that entire time, how do you define leadership now?
That's a really good question and very straightforward and simple. And so, looking back at those 40 years, I would say, just for starters, if you asked me when I entered the Coast Guard 40 years ago, maybe even just after my time as a cadet and a junior officer, I'd have a different definition of leadership than when I'm retired looking back on those 40 years, because I do have a maturity that happened over that time. And I believe that my definition of leadership now is a leader is somebody who can motivate people
Mm,
to achieve a mission, and focus those people on a shared purpose to be able to execute that mission. So motivating people towards a shared purpose and a shared mission. And I think that's critical, is the motivation and the fact that you have a shared purpose and a shared mission that everyone understands.
I think that is that's powerful, kind of like right out the gate of being able to provide motivation towards a shared vision. And I think that's so hard to do as a leader, at least when you're kind of starting out. When you're in the tactical level of leadership, it's hard to really create a shared vision or work towards a shared vision. So I love that definition. If you could take some time to let the listeners know who you are, because you have an amazing, truly amazing backstory.
Sure thing. I'll start a little bit of my background. I'll try to keep it to like 5 minutes or so as
Yeah.
not to hog the podcast. But there is a 300-page book, Breaking Ice and Breaking Glass, Leading in Uncharted Waters, that goes through my story. So it's hard to do in a few minutes, but it's important to have the context of where someone's coming from, where they've
Mm,
been, does influence where they go. And I started out being born in 1960, and that matters, in
yeah.
Ellicott City, Maryland. And that matters too, because it was close to the Naval Academy. And I was the oldest kid with three brothers. And I was a tomboy. My mom and dad treated us kids all the same. So, because it was mostly a family of boys and all the boys had their friends over, I think that really help prepare me eventually for a career in a mostly male environment. And I didn't have any
Mm,
idea when I was a kid that was going to happen. But I was a really shy young girl, even though I was the oldest with these three brothers. I wasn't shy around my brothers, maybe, but I was not confident, and shy. And I think that that's something else that I want to share, because so many people look at someone like me, Vice Admiral, and they think, oh, well, you must have been born, wearing a uniform and saluting. No, I started out very shy and unconfident. And as I got older, I found I was good in sports, and that helped build my confidence because I could win at swimming. And I got into high school, and well, okay, I'm trying to go too fast. I got to slow
no,
down.
yeah, I want
And
to
I
hear the whole
gotta
story.
tell about core values, because every time I give a talk, I start with core values. So when I was a kid,
Mm,
I, looking back, I developed my core values from my parents, my coaches, my teachers. And I
mm,
say looking back, because once again, as a young person, I didn't know what my personal core values were
yeah.
until later in my career when I reflected back and people would ask me, Admiral Stosz, or Commander Stosz, whatever rank I was, how did you succeed or become successful? And I'd have to think back to my core values and what really, what part of me really enabled me to continue on and become the leader I eventually became. And looking back, it was hard work and perseverance and honesty and humility. And I put them in
Mm,
pairs like that. And I think core values are so important. I also like the pairs because there's four core values. And I think that your core values are the foundation of your character. And your character determines who you are, the leader you're going to become. So if you
mm,
don't have a foundation of personal core values, you're going to struggle. Another analogy is the North Star. You're going to struggle with your course, with your direction. You're not going to have your grounding on who you are, or your ethics, all these things that some people find great dilemmas, moral and ethical dilemmas. If you're have a foundation of core values, you're going to be able to make those decisions, face those challenges when they come, and make the right decisions, not be mired down in ethical dilemmas, because you've got core values that you're standing on. So honesty and humility came from my parents. They expected a lot of us. And, kids will try to sometimes fib to get
Yeah.
out of things or whatever, because you're scared. So you fib. And I got embarrassed when my parents would catch me in a little lie. And I swore I'd never lie, because I couldn't tolerate that, even a small one that kids do to get out of a bad situation or whatever, when you're in trouble. And the humility, my father especially would always tell us kids, don't, get too caught up in your success. If you win a race, in first grade or whatever, don't let it go to your head, because there's always going to be somebody faster, stronger, and better. And you just need to keep humble, to
Yeah.
keep grounded. So honesty and humility. And then hard work and perseverance. I learned from being born in 1960. By the time I was a teenager, coming from a modest family, my dad was a civilian in the Navy. My mom was a homemaker. I knew I had to work to make money for college. And in the mid 70s, those of us who were old enough to remember the oil shock of the mid 70s and the real recession, where interest rates were 17%,
That
not
is crazy.
7.
Yeah, that is
And so
crazy.
there were no jobs available. Yeah.
Wow.
And so I went up to my grandparents, my paternal grandparents in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I labored on a tobacco farm in the
Mm.
Connecticut River Valley when I was, cucumber farm when I was 13, and then a tobacco farm when in, the earlier teens. So I go up there in the summertime and work on farm work, and it was really hard. It was
Yeah.
sweaty, hard, miserable work. There were no second chances. You had to make a quota on the tobacco farm, or you'd be fired. You were thrown in with local girls, girls who were bussed up, and it was segregated. Boys and girls had to work separately.
Oh,
There
wow.
were juvenile delinquents that were bussed up from somewhere down south and would stay in the UMass Amherst dorms over the summer to work as part of their program. And then there were Puerto Rican migrant laborers who came up to work in the summer and then would go home. So I was in the midst of this morass of real diversity, different cultures, backgrounds, ways of life. And you all were working to tie the tobacco up or sew the tobacco and get it hung in the barns. And as odd a mission as that was, this diverse group of people from all over Puerto Rico and all over America came together to work on this farm and get the product to market. And you had to make a quota or you'd be fired. But there was another thing, there was piecework. So if you did more than what was expected, you could get extra money. And I would use that to buy ice cream. Anyone who knows me knows I love ice cream. And I learned the value of doing more than what was expected, not just stopping at the minimum quota required, but doing as much as I could beyond expectations. So I learned, and I learned those characteristics: hard work and persevering through all those trials and tribulations. And then by the time I got into high school, I had the grounding of those core values.
Mm.
So personally, I was prepared, kind of. I was still shy.
Yeah.
And then the system was preparing for women. So in 1972, Title IX was put into effect, and that's the law that gives equality in sports and
Yeah.
education to girls and women. And then the next year, 1973, was the Equal Rights Amendment. And then in 1975, the National Defense Authorization Act of 76, which was passed in 75, required all the service academies to open their doors to women. So by the time I got into high school in 1974, Title IX and the Equal Rights Amendment had just been put in place. So I could play sports with assigned coaches, not just like the volunteer coach and no equipment or anything. So girls had equipment. We had the right gear. We had an assigned coach. And I found that sports, once again, I could succeed in sports, and it gave me the confidence I needed to have to apply to the Coast Guard Academy when that opportunity came.
Mm,
And that opportunity came when my neighbor walked over in 1976, when I was a junior in high school. My neighbor walked over a copy of the Baltimore Sun, which had run a feature article on the Naval Academy, which was kind of next door in Annapolis, Maryland, not far from
yeah.
me. And I'd always wanted to sail. There was always one or two rich kids in the neighborhood whose parents had a boat moored up in Annapolis. And I'm like, oh, I'd love to sail. I just had this urge to be on the water because my maternal grandparents lived on Cape Cod, where I live right now. And so I'd go up there in the summer times after working on the farm to get cleaned up in the salt water. And my granddad had a rowboat, a little old wooden rowboat.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, and he'd take me out, but I would kind of yearn for a sailboat and just to go further beyond just that little tiny bay. And so this Naval Academy caught my adventurous spirit, and I'm like,
Mm,
oh, women are allowed to apply. And I read all about it, and I saw the part where, yeah, you have to obligate 5 years of service as your payment, but as a free education. And I've been working to save money, and college was expensive, and there weren't many scholarships in those days. So I applied to the Naval Academy and went through all the politics of getting a senatorial nomination and all that. And my guidance counselor, who happened to be my swim coach, said, Sandy, you have to cast a wider net.
oh,
Um,
wow.
and
That's
I'm
great
like, PJ,
advice.
yeah, I'm like, PJ, I want to go to the Naval Academy. He says, well, look, I got this flyer in the mail from this place called the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. And we poured over that flyer. And between the two of us, we decided the Coast Guard was a small Navy.
I love
And of
it.
course, the Coast Guard's not a small Navy. And I didn't know this at the time. But once I got to the Coast Guard Academy, because spoiler alert, I actually accepted that nomination. But once I got there, I found out that the Coast Guard, once they had um, been, the National Defense Authorization Act had all the academies open up to women, the Coast Guard said, okay, if we're going to open up our academy to women, everything's going to be open to women, all of our specialties. So pointy end of the spear jobs like operations afloat and helicopter pilots. And
Mm,
so we had big cutters at the time, 378-foot cutters that at times were armed with Harpoon and Sea missile systems. Women could serve on those. And I sailed on one of those ships in 1978 as a cadet, while
wow.
the my peers at the Naval Academy were precluded through combat exclusion laws and policies for decades until just fairly recently.
Yeah.
Those laws and policies were undone. So I accepted at the Coast Guard Academy because I heard back from them really quickly because it's a direct admit. We're under Title 14 of the United States Code instead of Title 10, even though we're a member of the armed forces. So I accepted there because I wanted to go to a school that valued me for who I was
Mm,
and what I could do, not who I knew, which was
yeah.
the more political approach of the congressional nomination from the other academies like Annapolis Naval Academy. So that's a little bit of a story of my brief history of my childhood and how I formed my core values and how those core values helped me to have the courage and confidence to apply to one of the first classes to hold women at any of the service academies. So I entered the Coast Guard Academy in 1978 in the third class to have women.
Wow. There's so much to unpack there, but there's two things that I think really resonated, and I think listeners really need to understand. And is the first one, how long did it take you to understand those core values that you formed? You didn't know them at the time. I think, did you have to reflect on them? How did you discover that those were your core values and that they guided you to your true north? And I love that because I have the rule of true north. I think you and I have the same definition of when we encounter rough storms, rough decisions, rough experiences operationally, what gets us through those is our core values because it helps us guide our decisions. And that took me a really long time to master. And I wonder, when did that click with you?
It didn't click until I was a mid-grade officer to
Yeah.
a lower senior officer, like say the O5 level, which would be about 17, like 15 to 20 years into my career. And that's
Yeah.
when people started asking me, looking to me as a role model. I was a little more senior because when you're junior, you have peer-to-peer, I think, mentoring and role modeling, and role modeling down a little bit to lower level folks in the officer enlisted corps. But then you start to get a little more senior, and people ask you, "Hey, ma'am, how did you succeed? What led you to be able to command a ship?" And so I had to start thinking about those questions.
Yeah.
And so I looked back at my childhood and what traits
Mm.
and qualities had made me successful in
Yeah.
people's eyes. And everyone's got a different definition of success, but career success. And I reflected back and I thought, these are 4 core values that I think, and I love them in pairs: honesty and
Yeah.
humility, and hard work and perseverance. So no, I didn't know them. And so when I talk to audiences now, one reason I wrote the book and one reason I do podcasts and speaking engagements is to try to help young people, officer enlisted, civilian, to, earlier than I did this reflection,
Mm.
reflect back on your childhood, your schooling, your coaches, your mentors, your teachers, your strengths, your weaknesses, what you think has helped you become the person you are, and ask your friends or your coaches or your teachers, "Hey, what strong qualities do I have? What do you think has makes me successful?" And you can start piecing together your own set of personal core values
Yeah.
from that. So you have to sit down and do some reflection on where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, be honest with yourself, what motivates you and what helps you to be at your best. And then you start to develop those. And it helped me to have the organizational core values by my side.
Mm-hmm.
So the Coast Guard promulgated, isn't that always a hard word to say?
Yeah.
Our core values in 1996: honor, respect, and devotion to duty. So I
Mm.
also had the Coast Guard's core values in the back of my mind when I was looking at, what are my personal core values? And I think that the Navy and the Army and the Air Force
Yeah.
and the Space Force and the Marine Corps all have their service core values. So that's a good place to start for young
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. That is a beautiful example of figuring out where to start. I think as a leader, especially where you're just starting in the Army, for example, when you go to um, but 2 week war, I think it's a senior staff war college. I can't remember exactly when you're going to be a lieutenant colonel. They give you a program for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks, part of that, at least how it was before, they give you some time to develop, hey, your leadership philosophy and coming up with your core values. And it blows my mind that no time before, in the past 16 years of someone's career, that they actually take the time to think about that. And I was reading one of the mentor of mine that we're sharing before we started this podcast, John Maxwell, and he has a formula that just beautifully encompasses your legacy. Is that our thoughts, what we think, shapes our beliefs, what we believe in this world, our core values, what we hold most dear, ethically and morally, and then our beliefs drive our actions that we do daily, in and out, and then the actions over time compound into the legacy that people remember us by. And it all starts with this little squishy muscle between our noggin, between our 2 ears, and no one takes the time
Hmm.
to truly think. And that is so powerful. And I think that if anyone gets anything from this podcast, that's the one thing that I hope people get, is to stop, slow down. In the Army, they have an acronym. It's called a SEALs halt. Stop, look, listen, and smell. So we take a short halt. Yeah. We take off our hat, we take off our eye pro, and we
Uh,
just listen to the environment and let
mm,
the environment bring back to us. Like, we're looking for anomalies, anything that could potentially show that there's something here that's a threat to us.
mm.
And I think we have to do that in our life. That is amazing.
Yes, Josh, and starting early. And I will say that at the Coast Guard Academy, I can't speak for other academies or other education programs,
Yeah.
but we have our cadets write their first leadership philosophy when they're a cadet. And
Mm.
this is a big moment for them because we've put them through organization behavior and leadership. And we happen to use Posner and Kuz's book, The Leadership Challenge, for that. But we get them well versed in the theory of leadership. And we,
Mm.
of course, they experience leadership
Yeah.
in a service academy. But then we asked them to write a leadership philosophy, and they're very young. So as I said earlier, with my leadership definition, it morphed over time as I matured as a leader. But these young
Yeah.
people are writing a leadership philosophy, and they present it to a panel of officers who come in to listen to them. So it's a big deal, but it gets them started. And I'm sure that their leadership philosophies morph as they become more senior, but they at least get to be thinking about it, which is an important start.
That's another great point, ma'am, is that I think leadership philosophy changes over time. So I have a mentor of mine. So the Army recently launched a program, and it's a joint program too with the Navy and the Air Force, of a coaching culture, of trying to establish a coaching culture that's rooted in the International Coaching Federation kind of core competencies. And through that, J.R. Flatter developed this concept of a house of leadership. So instead of just words on a paper with a leadership philosophy, build a house of leadership. What is your foundational leadership kind of built on? What would your four walls look like? What would the principles and the pillars look like? And then what is your roof kind of built upon? And when I was going through that exercise of defining my house of leadership, it was really powerful. And it's funny because I was putting myself in those previous examples when I was a lieutenant, when I was in college as a cadet, and I didn't go to a military academy. I went through Marshall University and graduated through ROTC, but it would have been so immature. I think that's the best word to describe when I was starting out, that my leadership would have been so immature, because I would have had transformational leaders like yourself that I would have been able to glean wisdom from, and then want to adopt that in my leadership philosophy kind of going forward. And that's great.
Yes, when I was a lieutenant at '03 and took over my first command, which was a ship, an icebreaker on the Great Lakes, I had a command philosophy that I wrote, which I would argue is different than a leadership philosophy. But my
Mm,
command philosophy, when I look back at it now and I saved the darn thing, a one pager, it was pretty elementary. It had
yeah.
important things like communications and things like that. But when I ended up with the privilege of having the job as superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy, I came up with a new leadership philosophy that was much different than anything I had in the past written about my philosophy or thoughts on command or leadership. And my do you mind if I share my leadership philosophy?
Yes. Oh, I would love
I
to hear it.
I don't want to hog up the podcast, so just a few minutes. But my leadership philosophy that I wrote at the Coast Guard Academy was intended intentionally not to be a command philosophy, because I wanted it to be guidance to my
Mm,
large, diverse um, cohort of people at the Coast Guard Academy, the workforce, um, as to what I expected of them, how I expected them to act,
mm,
not just what I expected them to do. So a command philosophy
I
kind
love
of
that.
is what you want them to do. Here's our mission. Here's what we're going to do. Here's maybe even how we're doing it. Um, but how you act is different. How you comport yourself, what your values are. So my leadership philosophy has three pieces. I do like things in three. I learned that early on,
Yeah, the
and I
rule of
do
three.
I do agree that three is a good thing for people to keep their attention on. So the first piece is believe in yourself and others. And this comes from the fact that I was a shy, unconfident person. And I found that was a detriment to me, but not just to me, to anybody I led. Because if you are a shy person who's sort of unconfident and don't project the confidence that goes with your competence, your boss
Mm,
is not going to see that. You might not get the promotion, and you might say, well, it's because I'm a woman and it's discrimination or something. Well, no, maybe it's because you're not projecting the confidence to go with your competence. So your boss doesn't think you're ready yet. And if you're not that confident, maybe you are the same with how you treat your people. If you don't believe in yourself, maybe you don't believe in your people. Maybe you're hard on your
mm,
people. So it's really important to believe in yourself and others. And there's more to it, but I'll just make the short version. And then the second is believe in yourself and others. Um, Build trust and earn respect. So this is the centerpiece of the leadership philosophy. And it goes back to this idea of humility, being
Yeah.
humble, because it's really easy as you get more senior to outgrow your your humility and become a
100%.
victim of
Yeah.
hubris. And so I always try to keep humble by coming into work every single day with a mission to earn the respect, build the
Mm,
trust, and not presume it's there because of what's on my shoulders. So if I have to go to my position power, it means I'm failing in my personal power and my professional power. And those are the 3 P's of power, another lesson of mine. But making it your mission to build trust and earn respect every single day, no matter where you are in the organization, it doesn't just apply to junior people to be
yeah.
respectful. More senior people than most senior people need to show that same respect and build that trust. And you build that trust by living your core values. So build trust and earn respect every day. And those are active verbs, build and earn,
I
not
love that.
passive that you can take for granted. And
Yeah.
then finally, demonstrate moral courage. And I
Mm,
became very passionate about this as I got more senior because I saw that so many people just looked the other way and didn't want to confront somebody, even if the person
yes.
was definitely misbehaving, underperforming. And there is a famous saying, and we have in the armed forces at least: the standard you walk past is the standard you accept.
Yes.
So the person who's not groomed properly, the person who's
Mm,
agitating somebody or making crude comments, the person who's underperforming, quiet quitting,
yeah.
you
I
know,
don't I don't get that.
yeah, you look past all that as a leader or a peer, and that's what's accepted. And oh my gosh, I saw that time after time after time. And I took over a command where the leader, had been too nice. So I'm kind of soured on this whole thing about be nice, because I think you
Yeah.
should be firm and fair, respectful, considerate, all that stuff. But I think being nice, you start to get into this area where you're not going to hold people accountable. And then
Yeah.
everybody else in the office or the work environment who is putting it all on the line every day looks left and right and says, well, I get no more reward. This person's getting away with it every day, not doing the job or misbehaving. And the boss is doing nothing about it because they're afraid to confront them. So I'm sorry to go on about that, but I think that demonstrating moral courage is so important. And we all revere physical courage. There's medals of honor for it. There's all kinds of accolades. But I'm here to tell you, if you demonstrate moral courage, you're equally as likely to be
Yeah.
ridiculed, called on the carpet, questioned for why you made that decision when you could have looked the other way and just kept everything quiet.
Yeah.
So believe in yourself and others, build trust and earn respect, and demonstrate moral courage is the leadership philosophy that I try to live by.
There's so much to unpack there, and it reminded me of a story from one of my bosses of recently I just had. So I switched from infantry to acquisitions, and my first boss that I had, yeah, I fell in love with him as a leader. He would walk around every single day, and I could hear him coming, talking to people by name, like, "Hey Jim, how was your weekend? Hey, how was your son's wrestling match?" And like, and he was getting ready to retire as an 05 colonel. He's on his way out, but he truly cared about the people so much. And I always talk about leading the whole person, is that you're not just leading the individual at work, you're leading their families. In a way, like when I was leading soldiers, I had to help mentor the entire family sometime, and I would welcome that, because I think leadership isn't just a light switch on and off. When you're in the role, you're in the role, and you have to embrace it. But he had a thing called the AMSA norm. So it was Aviation Mission Systems and Architecture, AMSA, and PEO Aviation. And it was a list of norms of how we would act daily. And I've never seen that
Mm.
before. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, I'm stealing that. And I'm gonna take it with me as I grow my leadership journey. And that was beautiful. And I never thought about that until you brought that story back up. Another thing that you just said, I think, is crucial for moral courage when you're just starting out as a junior officer, because you're kind of in that place of where my old battalion sergeant major, Kenny Claiborne, would say, leadership is not likership. It's not a popularity contest. You're going to make tough decisions, and sometimes you have to be unreasonable. And I think that's a tenet of a true transformational leader is being unreasonable. And when you see something, you have to correct it on the spot, because now you've just lowered the organizational standard and you're holding different levels of accountability. And if you hold someone to a standard, you should hold yourself and everyone to that same standard. And that was such a beautiful point, ma'am, that I wanted to make sure that we hit that again.
And it's easier said than done.
It
So
is.
I had, a year a year and a half leading our Coast Guard boot camp with the young people coming in from a listed session, and then 4 years leading our academy. Peer pressure and peer-to-peer leadership is very difficult to demonstrate that moral courage, to hold your peers accountable, because you're also told to stand by each other.
Yeah.
Don't leave anybody behind. So does that mean overlooking some of their misbehavings to keep the group together? Cadets, young people struggle with what it means to demonstrate moral courage, to not be a bystander.
Mm.
When is it appropriate for a peer to intervene and call out another peer? And then how do you do that? So part of the demonstrating moral courage, the active ingredient in demonstrating moral courage correctly, is how you do it.
Yes.
You can do it and you can have somebody shamed, or you can do it where you save face for everybody but correct the problem. And then everybody wins, as opposed to, nailing somebody in the spotlight and shaming them. There's ways
Yeah.
to get at the end result in the right way. So I think that's one of the reasons people shy away from holding people accountable and having those honest conversations, is because they don't know that there's a way you can do that well
Yeah.
and communicate well, and everybody goes away stronger and better for it.
There's a great book by Kim Scott I read in
Yeah.
2020. Did you read it too, ma'am?
Crucial conversations, radical
Uh,
candor,
Radical Candor. And when I read that, it's so true, is that great organizations, and I kind of broke it down, the constructive candor, is that you have to be able to challenge someone from a position of where it's not coming off as a personal attack. And I think that there's no good way to do that. And I struggled at that, especially when I was a junior officer, because I would come in like a bull with a china shop and I would just start breaking things because I thought that's what a leader did. And then I started to mature. And then I realized when I was doing that, when I was doing a bull in a china shop, I was building walls between myself and the men and the women that I was leading. And now they weren't coming to me with ideas. And there's a quote by Colin Powell: the day that your men and women stop bringing problems to you, that's the day you're no longer their leader. And when I read that, I was like, wow, it like struck me to my core. And then I read that book to try to help me kind of learn how to be constructive with candor, because that's a weak spot of mine. That's a deficiency that I had to get. But that doesn't come naturally. How did you learn to apply that moral courage?
I had some experiences that helped me understand that it could be positive. And
Mm,
so maybe I'll just give you a simple one, because there's probably hundreds of examples. But when I was the first and only woman to report aboard in 1985, so it's a long time ago, and I always want that context there because it's
yeah.
much has changed. But all male ship of 50 men, and I'm the first and only woman to report aboard. I was the operations officer, and the guys didn't know what to do with a woman on board. It was really in the early stages. I could never outrun being the first, because I was one of the first women officers to graduate from a service academy.
You're a
So,
pathfinder.
so I kind of had to help the guys to understand what it was, what it meant to work with and for a woman, and that it wasn't really all that different than working with and for a man. But and so I tried to use my personal and professional power to build trust and earn respect with a crew, and help them to understand what was
Mm,
appropriate behavior with a woman on board. And then one night, about a couple or 3 months maybe into my time on the ship, we were underway on a patrol, And it was something like a quiet watch, like the midnight watch or something. And one of the quartermasters said to me, "Ma'am," he says, "we like having you on board because we don't want to hear those, crude behaviors and stuff on the mess deck, which is the place where they eat. But now we can use you as an excuse, and we can say you can't do that. Miss Stosz is on board." And
Mm.
so I'm like, "You got to be kidding me!" I'm thinking, this is empowering, so I have this whole little talk on the power of being different. So I'm like, wow. And so the next day, I walked down the passageway or the hallway to that mess deck where they were all eating, and I heard a guy cussing, and I remember who it was, and I said, "Kenny," I said, "would you say that in front of your mom or your sister or your daughter?" And he says, "Oh no, ma'am." And I said, "Well, you can't say it in front of me either." And I said it funny like that. And there was guys on the mess deck, and everybody laughed. So I kind of made it humorous, I made it easy, and
Yeah.
everyone could laugh about it. But Kenny never cussed again, right? Maybe at least not when I was around.
Yeah.
So it kind of taught me that there's a power in being different, and not to be shy, and to shy away from asking somebody not to cuss, because
Mm.
you have an obligation. You might be the one that people are looking to create a better workplace climate. And
Yeah.
maybe you've got the power to do that because you're different, and you're able to stand up and say, "Hey, that's not appropriate," and say it with humor, or say it in a light way, and say it in the appropriate way. Not every situation is different.
Yeah.
But I found that I owed it to myself and other people in my workplace to find the way to approach people, and to have them understand that their behavior or actions weren't appropriate. So that little lesson there, when I was the only woman, is one thing. And I think walking into situations where I was met with the consequences of my predecessor and other people tolerating inappropriate behaviors or
Yeah.
performances was another lesson to me. And the workplace was miserable. So it wasn't just that I didn't want to have to deal with somebody who wasn't pulling their load. Everybody was brought down, and the whole workplace was in a bad state of morale because of it. So I learned through those experiences. So certainly when I was very young, I wouldn't have had all that. And that's,
Mm.
I think, the power of having many years in a position. So I've got the 40 years of experience. But I'm here to tell you, when I was superintendent of the Coast Guard Academy, my nephew, my poor nephew, he was a cadet.
Oh no.
He was my godson, a cadet, my same last name. The kid could not hide. But I learned more from cadets than you would imagine. So even here
Mm.
I was with all these decades of experience as a leader, but I learned very interesting, very fresh, honest perspectives of
Mm.
current generation younger people that I had moved beyond in a bad way because I couldn't
Yeah.
relate anymore. So I think that another learning experience of how you deal with behaviors or how you have moral courage is you need to understand the workforce from the entry level to the executive level, and all the kinds of diversity in between there. You can't be a good leader, and you can't demonstrate moral courage unless you have that emotional intelligence that I
Mm.
think you can learn and get better at. I think some people are more gifted than others, but you
Yeah.
can practice being situationally aware, getting to know everybody, knowing where the areas of conflict are, knowing and getting that sense so that you can intervene in the appropriate manner. So that when you do intervene, going back to what I first said, you do it the right way, and you get a result that is positive, not something that alienates people and maybe makes the situation even worse.
Yeah, that's I had a battalion commander tell me that once, and I think you just hit the nail on the head, is that a leader's job, and I was doing my first company live fire, and when you have 131 soldiers where you're kind of orchestrating, if you're a Megadeth fan, like the symphony of destruction, that's like the best analogy of a company or a battalion live fire, or even a brigade live fire. And I was always struggling of where I placed myself on the battlefield. Where do I need to be? Where do I need to be? Because I have comms with everyone. I can see the phase lines that we're going to. And he pulled me aside during a live fire, and he told me, "Josh, you need to be at the point of friction. Anticipate where friction is going to be on the battlefield, and put yourself there because your junior officers, your junior leaders are going to need your guidance and wisdom to get through that. And I've always applied that in my life is that I chase the hard things and I look for friction. And you beautifully sum that up is that if you allow that kind of culture to resonate in your organization, it's going to quickly morph into something that people don't want to be a part of anymore. And it's going to lead to very toxic, very negative side effects. And I think that that was just beautifully summed up. I'd like to transition kind of, quickly. You've had such an amazing military career, like truly amazing, and a lot of firsts. When did you discover your spark of that, hey, this path in the Coast Guard is right for me, and I'm going to stay in it for a long term? Because in the Army, there's different points of where, it'll be a company grade officer is like, I'm done with the Army. And then, okay, I'm now a major. I'm done with the Army. And now you make it as lieutenant colonel and you go to a colonel and you make it all the way to a 3-star general, which is just super inspiring to me. But when did you discover that spark that this was, you were all in?
So early on, but then there's an inflection point that I'll talk
Mm,
about. So I have found success with answering questions with the first thing that comes into my mind. And I actually kind of have had a similar question in the past. But believe it or not, I was very early on as a cadet, and I
wow.
was sailing from Seattle to San Francisco on a swab summer or a boot camp like cruise on the Coast Guard Bark Eagle. It's a 300-foot sailing ship, America's tall ship.
A
And
boot
the
camp cruise?
yes, the
Wow.
reward. Now, a cruise is a cruising in the Navy and the Coast Guard doesn't mean
Yeah, I think I'm
cruising
thinking
in
of
the
it wrong.
Caribbean. Cruising means you're out there on patrol on a ship
Okay.
at sea doing the mission. So we were, though, when you come into the Coast Guard Academy or any of the service academies, you have a summer of a boot camp experience, your first freshman
Mm,
year, freshman summer. And the reward for all that boot camp is a week on the Eagle, and you're training still and sailing and pulling on lines and standing watch and everything. But oh my goodness, being on that ancient sailing ship, like our forefathers in the sea services, and the Coast Guard started out as a revenue cutter service under Alexander Hamilton in
wow.
1790. And I mean, some of that stuff, even in my young brain, just kind of like, just was like a dream come true. Here I am on a sailing ship. I wanted to sail all my life. I'm looking up at the stars, standing extra watches at night because I love it so much, getting
Mm,
exhausted. And I'm like, this is what I want to do. And
yeah.
I became a cutterman. I was 12 years at sea in the Coast Guard, and you go to sea and then you have to go to shore. So even though I was in for quite a few more years than that, you rotate ship to shore. So I love being at sea. But when I had commanded a 210-foot Coast Guard cutter in Kittery, Maine, when I walked off that cutter, I walked off as an '05, and the next step for me, I was going to a shore job, but the next step would be coming back to sea for one more ship bigger, a 378-foot ship.
Wow.
And that would be the normal career progression for an afloat officer. The same thing as a
Mm,
surface warfare officer in the Navy would
okay.
be to take that bigger ship. But something just ate away at me. And this is where the divergent path comes. And I'm like, I feel a little uneasy because I've been 12 years at sea. Going back to this bigger ship is just a little bigger ship doing the same kind of thing. Not that it's not incredibly worthy work, but what was my real passion? And I say this because I think that there's a lot of people who try to follow their passion and they're
Mm,
confused. They want something perfect. Your passion can change over time, and you should be receptive to career inflection points, and you
yeah.
should listen when you hear the call to explore. So I said, okay, what's making me uneasy? What do I love about being at sea? And I'm like, well, certainly it's the mission. It's stars in the sky. It's watching the sun come up. It's the excitement. Well, then I thought, no, it's not any of that. Oh, that's great, but it's watching a young recruit come on board at a boot
Mm,
camp, and the person is confused, and they report aboard, and they're messing up at first, and they're getting yelled at by their chief or their sergeant major. And then 2 weeks later, you see that same young person. You don't even recognize them. They're pulling on the line with confidence. They're singing out the response to the command. And you're like, oh my gosh. So developing young leaders of
Mm,
character became my passion. And I put my letter in to not screen for command for a ship, but to ask to screen for command of our boot camp. The Coast Guard's boot camp is Training Center, Cape May, New Jersey. So I applied for that job and I was very fortunate to get it. There's only one and it was open that year.
wow.
And I always thought that God has a plan for me, for my career. And that a lot of what happens to me is because, it's there's something besides my own will that's driving me or assigning me. So I was assigned to that job as the captain of our boot camp, did that, and then eventually made admiral and went off to command the Coast Guard Academy. So at that point in my career, I diverged away from my sea duty, my primary career path, and asked to go into leading and developing the next generation of Coast Guard men and women.
Wow. That's amazing. I think throughout that whole journey, what was the most challenging circumstance that you had to overcome?
It wasn't the mission. It wasn't. There were some really hard missions, but you know what? Oh my gosh, when I think back on, I was scared, tired, hungry, tired, scared, and wet, sometimes all at once at
Yeah.
sea. But there
It
was
sounds like
such,
Ranger School.
oh God. And Ranger School, you're sort of on your own, but you are helping each other. But when
Yeah.
you get to your platoon and company, and I know you commanded, you are all together as a
Mhm.
team. And I never met an operational situation that my team didn't amaze me with their competence, professionalism, ability to get the job done. And despite being scared, wet, hungry, and tired, we got the job done. It was the
Mm.
personnel issues. That's why I had demonstrate moral courage in my command, my leadership philosophy. It was some of these personnel issues where you had people that were quiet quitting. It's a new term, I know. I'm just kind of being
Yeah.
a little facetious with that, but people who weren't pulling their fair share, who'd been in too long but wouldn't leave, and there's I don't know, just some of the personnel problems were they would get you down after a while
Yeah.
because you have most people are really giving it and putting it on the line, and then you've got other people who are seeing how little they can do, and I found that to be discouraging. It
Yeah.
pained me. So that was the hardest part, I think, was the personnel issues.
I think you and I share that same thing. I came in so naive to my first company command, and I wouldn't say naive. I guess I would say hopeful that I was not going to have any SIRs, no CCIRs, so serious incident reports, and that just did not happen. And I saw soldiers that weren't giving their all, and I saw soldiers, most of them, 99% of them, doing everything that they could to make the organization better. And it kind of just hurt my soul, I guess is the best way to
Mm-hmm.
put it, to see soldiers there not pulling their weight, because I've seen what it costs in an operational environment when a soldier doesn't pull their weight. And I always try to like get that across to them, but sometimes you just can't reach that individual. They're just not ready to listen, or where they're at in life, they just don't care at that point. It's challenging and it's frustrating, ma'am, and I completely I share that with you. So I would love to kind of take it to where you currently are right now. So I know that you've wrote a book in 2021.
June 1st, 2021, I published
Yeah.
Breaking Ice and Breaking Glass, Leading in Uncharted Waters.
Yeah, so I don't want to like give away a lot of that book, but what was your favorite part about writing that?
Oh, I just loved sitting down and writing
Mm,
about the stories that had resulted in all the leadership lessons that I learned. And it was hard at first because I had to, some of the stories, I couldn't remember everything. I called up shipmates and said,
yeah.
hey, you were on this ship with me. We did this operation. Tell me your perspective and what you remember. So I had, I knew I had all this inside me that I wanted to give back, different leadership lessons, but how to put them out in a way that people could enjoy reading and understand and come away with a resource they could really use to help them become a better leader. And so I found the most fun part was looking at where combining, taking the stories and extracting the leadership lessons.
Mm,
And it was interesting because I had people who are in the publishing industry who know this business say, well, it has to either be a memoir or a leadership book. It can't be both. And I'm like, well, it's
Why
a
can't it?
leadership book.
Yeah.
It's a very readable leadership book because you will hear my story of my career
Hmm.
as you read the book, because it's all told through stories. And I've gotten great feedback on that, because a lot of nonfiction leadership books are more, here's the lessons you're going to learn. And there might be stories behind them. It's some story from a case study from a company, or
Yeah.
stories of different leaders who have done well, and here's the lessons. But this is my personal journey, and here's the stories that I experienced, and here's the leadership lessons I learned. So it's a
Hmm.
very readable leadership book, and I had fun with constructing it that way, because I feel like in the end I really ended up with something that is the resource that I was hoping it to be. And it's hard to write a book.
Yeah. How long did it take you to write?
a
It
year and a
seems so
half,
daunting.
a
Wow.
year and a half, and I wrote for like about a year and a half. I wrote for like 6 hours a day on average,
Wow.
but I had to. So I'm not like a naturally gifted writer who can just.
Yeah.
People dictate their books. I was just reading a book about one of my favorite authors, Fyodor Dostoevsky. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his name right, even.
Mm.
Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wrote Crime and Punishment, and
Yeah.
so I was reading a book about him, and he dictated his books to a stenographer.
Wow.
He never wrote them, so I can't even imagine trying to just have it all fall out on the page from my brain. I have to put it on the computer and massage it and go back and wordsmith it, and the way you write for an audience to read is far different than how you speak in front of
Hmm.
an audience. So you have to be a lot more precise, and have everything has to tie together and make sense. That takes some time. And then I had a developmental editor who kind of just bled all over my first draft, and I had to go back to ground zero a little bit on it, which I didn't mind, because I saw it all coming out to where I could get my final result that I wanted.
Wow. Yeah, that's one of my 10-year visions, kind of for the vision that I've created for my life, is that I want to write a book one day. But it's so daunting to me. It's scary. I think your goals should be big enough to scare you, but also to inspire you. And writing a book
Mm-hmm.
is scary and inspiring all at the same time, because I'm just, from humble rural West Virginia. I'm the first person in my family to ever go to college. And I'm afraid, like, if I tried to do the dictation, that person would be like, "What'd you say?" Because my accent
Oh,
would come
I
out.
am. I am reading right as we speak. My
Yeah.
book that I have is Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance.
Oh,
Have
I
you
wanna
read that
read
one?
that. I wanna read that. That's on my list this
No
year.
excuses. He was from Kentucky, right next door to West Virginia. I think that they thought West Virginia was sophisticated.
Oh,
It's a
I
good
love
book.
that.
It's an interesting perspective. So I think that I enjoy reading this book, Hillbilly Elegy, because I'm not sure it's the best book. I know it's not the best book, but it gives you a perspective of
Mm,
somebody who did come from a very tough background and yet still succeeded. And I love that, because I hate to see people nowadays, the victim mentality, and
yeah.
I'm not privileged, so therefore I could never succeed, or I had a hard life, so therefore I can't, ever succeed. I'm like, no, that should just be motivation to do better. I don't buy all that stuff about you have to be no better than where you came from.
I think that goes to the Cartman triangle. A lot of times with coaching, I see that is that people always want to play the victim mentality, is like, "Oh, poor me, poor me." But you need to shift the way you think, and your perspective is that you're not a victim. You're a survivor and a thriver, and not to just drift through life, because in 5 years, for example, you're going to be just as miserable and 5 years older if you don't take action at that time. That's amazing. So I would love to hear long term, 5 to 10 years, where do you want to grow and continue to make a change in leaders' lives?
So it's interesting. That's a great question, but you could ask it of a 20-year-old or a 63-year-old. I'm a 63-year-old now, as I already let go that I was born in 1960. So my 10-year horizon, that means I would be 73. So I got to be honest
Yeah.
with you. My you know capstone goal in life was to write this book.
Mm,
And I did all those years, 40 years in uniform. And the book is the culmination of all that. Now I have a bi-monthly blog, and I encourage everyone to go check it out. It's on my website. I know you'll ask for this later, but
yeah.
the blog is twice a month I write something about leadership that I hope is a nugget that people can use to help them become a better leader. So I intend to continue that blog. I have a number of volunteer boards and advisory councils. And right now I just came onto the board of the Surface Navy Association. We had our annual symposium in DC, and I feel like I can
Oh, wow.
help advance young people wanting to be surface naval officers or Coast Guard cuttermen. We have both the Surface Navy and the Coast Guard have lots of ships coming offline, and we need more people to want to go to sea. And I am involved in a couple of I'm chair of the Sailing Council at the Coast Guard Academy, and I gift my books to cadets and to students at the Coast Guard Academy. So I can see that in the next 5 to 10 years, I'm going to continue my
Mm,
leadership efforts along the same lines they are, but I don't have a goal of another book. I plan to continue my leadership development through my blog. Who
mm.
knows? Maybe there's another book there. I would adamantly say no at first when I finished writing the Breaking Ice and Breaking Glass. And I'd had that as a vision for 30 years. I knew I was writing that book. But now I could be convinced to do another one. And I have all these great blogs, and I could put those together into a book too. So I am kind of cogitating that, is
Mm.
compiling those blogs into some kind of a book with different chapters of different, categories. So sorry, that's a little bit of a rambling answer, but it kind of shows you that at my stage of life, I'm looking at being open to where I can add value in the leadership area, and influencing people to become the best they can be, whether it's through going to sea and having the same excitement that I had, or whether it's going on to advanced education or becoming a better reader. So I am looking for different ways to advocate, and I'm doing that through my nonprofit boards and advisory councils and my leadership blogging and talking.
See, I love that because it just shows that someone who's had an extremely successful career, above probably 99% of most military officers, follows the rule of 3 Cs that I like to call. They're still committed, they're still coachable, and they're still curious. You're still curious and you still wanna make an impact, and I love that you're not done yet. The last question before we get to our final show segment, and this is one that I've been dying to ask you. Out of 40 years, what is the most impactful leadership lesson that you can remember?
Oh, it's easy. It's an easy question
Uh,
because it came early in my career. So therefore, I was able to use it all my career and pass it on more than anything
mm,
else. So when I was an ensign, which is an '01, which means
yeah.
I was only about 22, I reported aboard a Coast Guard icebreaker going to Antarctica. And I was in my
Oh,
first
wow.
job coming out of the Coast Guard Academy, a 4-year college, and I'm in a leadership position at a very junior level. But I was leading somebody who was on a punishment detail.
No.
So I was like the officer of the day on the ship, and I was leading a few people who've been in trouble. So these were not your best performing crew members, and they were hard to lead because they didn't want to. They're already in trouble. Why would they listen to some new ensign? So anyway, I go to my boss and I said to him, Lieutenant Thompson, how can I need advice? How do I lead these people? And they're not really wanting to follow my orders. And he said,
Mm,
Sandy, there's 3 P's of power: personal power, professional power, and position power. And you're going to succeed in this Coast Guard if you lean on the first two, which is your personal power, professional power, and leave the position power only for emergencies, last resort. And and the and I just never forgot that. So the personal power is your emotional intelligence. It's how much you care about your people, understand them, want to um, be interested in them, um, take care of them. Your professional power is how you present yourself. It's how much you know. It's how hard you work. I think your core values and your character fit in all there. And then your position power is what's on your rank or your rate. And how many people, so many people go right to that. And so just because you're an ensign doesn't mean this fireman, which is a non-rated person, is going to do anything for you because they're already in trouble. But if you can influence that person on a personal level or professionally, you're fair to them. You ask them, hey, you've got this job to do. What can I do to help you get it done? Do you need more equipment? Do you need, what do you need to get this job done? How can I help you get this job done? So instead of just, hey, you're going to go clean the bilge for the next hour, try to find a way to make a relationship with that person. And now, of course, you've got to, this is not easy because, of course, you are the ensign. The person is a non-rate in trouble who needs to get the job done. But how can you inspire, to go back to the very first way we opened the show, is the hallmark of a good leader is, can you inspire people to get the job done on a shared mission? So, hey, Fireman Brown, the one in trouble, you're in trouble and you got to clean these bilges. But when we get the ship underway, the clean bilges means that we can go to Antarctica and get the mission done. So actually, even though you're in trouble, you're doing a really important job. So maybe I could inspire Fireman Brown to want to do that job, even though he was in trouble.
That's beautiful. And I'm going to take that and carry that forward with me. The 3 forms of power: personal, professional, and positional. Yeah,
it's in my book.
Yeah. I have to read your book. And I felt guilty in a way that I brought you on my podcast and I haven't got a chance to read it yet. But I don't know if you're like me. I have different layers of books that I want to read in a year. I promise you that you're on my list of 2023 books, but I have a problem of where I'm have an insatiable appetite of reading, but I try to slow down my reading in a way, because before I would just consume, and I didn't feel that I was really taking any of that wisdom. So now I kind of journal while I'm going through reading the book, so I can really let that just mature and marinate in my mind. So that's amazing. The last show segment, so this is, I call the killer bees. It's the same 4 questions that I ask everyone. So be brief, be present, be gone, and be brilliant. So the same 4 questions. If you're ready, we'll go ahead and start with the first one.
It sounds like a game show. I'm ready.
Yeah, I know, right? So what do you believe separates an average leader from an extraordinary leader?
An average leader from an extraordinary leader. Motivation.
Okay. I love that. Question 2. What is one resource that you can recommend to our listeners?
My blog.
Yeah.
I also, so not just my blog, but podcasts like yours. When I'm on the treadmill, the elliptical, I put in a podcast. I've got your podcast loaded on Apple Podcasts. I've got a number of other podcasts loaded on there, and they're all leadership podcasts. So I would recommend my blog, other blogs on leadership, and podcasts that you can easily access. A blog is short, so it's not a whole novel or a whole leadership nonfiction book. Or a podcast you can do while you're working out.
I love that. So question 3, if you had an opportunity to go back in time, meet your younger self, and I'm really interested with this question because you've learned so much at a young age, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
Oh gosh, because I started out so shy and unconfident, I would say, don't worry, there is so much power in being different. And there is power in being confident and marrying your confidence with your competence. So I would just encourage myself to understand there is power where I thought I was weak, if I could turn the tables and look at it that way.
Wow. So the last question is, how can our listeners find you? And then more importantly, how can they add value to you?
Okay. So you can catch all that we've talked about on my website, which is www.sandrastosz, all one word, .com. And there's tabs on there for my book. You can purchase that anywhere books are sold. I always like to support independent bookshops. Go down and order it from your local bookstore. You can sign up for my blog on my website. At the bottom of every page, you can sign up for my newsletter, and that's how I issue my blog every 2 weeks. And you can catch my blogs right on that website too. So that's how you could add value to me. And if you do buy the book, leave a review. Just like podcasters want to have a review, those things matter when it comes to people looking to see if they want to download Tales of Leadership onto their device.
Yeah. Ma'am, thank you so much for spending the hour with me and discussing one of my passions, which is leadership. There's been nuggets throughout this entire episode, and I have 4 pages of notes. So I can't wait to read your book because I'm pretty sure I'm going to have about 10 blogs that come out of it. So thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Josh.